Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to talk about X-rays, which probably is not what the organizers thought I would talk about when they invited me, but I appreciate the invitation anyway. So this is some work that we've been working on for a couple years, but this is actually one of the first public talks where we've described what we're doing. Just an outline on what I want to talk about. I'm actually going to review, for some of you that may not have seen it before, some of the background on compressive tomography that we've been working on for around 10 years or so, and talk about how that led us to X-rays. X-rays are an example of radiance tomography in the way we talk about it, and so I want to talk about some background on radiance tomography. And then finally, in the third part, I'll get to why we're imaging X-rays. I mean, I'm noticing that this is a meeting on next generation medical imaging. I can't help but notice that I seem to be the only person talking about X-rays, which is, you know, obviously an important medical imaging technology. You might think it's mature. I'm finding it's extremely immature, that there's just enormous opportunities, it turns out, in X-rays. And then finally I'll tell you about some experiments we did, published earlier this year in Optics Express on coded aperture X-ray scatter imaging and why we did that, and then some continuing work we're doing to expand that to a more rapid X-ray tomography. I started working on radiance tomography actually quite a while ago in a conceptual way. This is some work from 2004 on something we called reference structure tomography. We never did, I mean, we did experiments in the optical regime with this. It's an obvious thing to do for X-rays, but we never worked on X-rays until this last year, mostly because we just had the opportunity, thanks to some funding from the Department of Homeland Security, to really start a major X-ray effort recently. The original idea with reference structure tomography and sort of the compelling interest that I have is when you build an imaging system, any kind of measurement system, you have choices in the physical hardware. And you have, you know, field that you send out, illuminate a sample, you have field that comes back through the aperture. You'd like some confidence that you chose the best measurements. Did you build the physical system that made the right measurements to get as much information about the object as you could? And we treated that in a fairly abstract way, you know, in 2004, where we said, well, we'll allow ourselves to say that the field is just rays. It propagates in radiance, and then we can modulate the field by putting objects in the rays, by obscuring it with arbitrary 3D structures. And so this was an example of that, where, you know, these are all rays that go through a volume. We have detectors on a circle that surrounds the object, and these obscurants that could go between the object and the detectors. We said, well, what would be the best obscurants to put in that would code the visibility in ways that we could invert? And the one thing we discovered right away was that the number of different object signature cells, the number of points in the object, the regions that have the same coding on the detectors, grows much faster than the number of obscurants, grows faster than the complexity of the optics, basically, and the complexity of the detectors. And what that meant was that this is a fundamentally ill-conditioned problem. But we found that didn't really matter if we made this complex enough. And this was an example of, we had some simple object like this that we could project on a wavelet basis. But if the object is 64 by 64 in size, so, you know, 64 squared cells that we reconstructed with just 64 measurements using a just kind of least squares estimator. And so this was for us a start of thinking about compressive tomography. We did some simple experiments with that back then, where we built actually three-dimensional reference structures, and we showed that we could get patterns we actually pointed this out the window, and we could track cars driving by looking at the kind of complex patterns that they formed on the sensor. And this was a silly little experiment to do, but actually a fairly important change in the way we thought about measurement systems. Because we work a lot on compressive measurement, and I'll tell you the definition of compressive measurement is you're going to estimate n object parameters from m measurements, where m, the number of measurements, is less than the number of object parameters that you want to estimate. Okay? Now, the definition of tomography is that you're going to estimate an object in, you know, d dimensions from measurements distributed over d dimensions, where the measurement dimension is lower than the object dimension. And usually you balance that with time, and there's concepts of conservation of dimensionality. What happens when you get to these kind of generalized sensors is that you've broken that order. There isn't really a natural dimension for the measurement data. That objects exist, objects have dimensionality in two senses. They have dimensionality in the sense of the number of pixels you estimate, and they have dimensionality in terms of what is their embedding dimension, which is an order for the pieces in the object. The pixels are ordered in some way, and that's why images are compressible. Measurement data doesn't have to have an order. And when you go to this kind of, I'm going to apply arbitrary codes, there's no sense in which there's a natural space in which the measurements exist. And once you say the measurements don't have an order, you're no longer convinced that dimensionality should be conserved in tomographic systems. That you don't have a dimensionality in the measurements, so why should the dimensionality of the measurements be in any way similar to the dimensionality of the reconstruction? And then you get to the idea of compressive measurement. So this tomography and compressive measurement turn out to be kind of integrally linked. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think some of the more compelling demonstrations of compressive measurement are all in tomography. I think these are all examples where there is no other way to make these measurements, and it turns out to be just a compelling and exact way to say this was a good idea. One of the examples that we've had some success with in compressive, so basically now let me give you some more background on tomography. There are four major classes of tomography, and maybe five if we're going to be kind of generous. The 4 or 5 majors, maybe 6, I can keep thinking of more. The 3 that I'm interested in have to do with radiation fields. The 3 interesting ones for radiation fields are fields that are coherent fields, fields that are modeled by radiance functions, propagating rays, and fields that are modeled by coherence functions. So those are the 3 major classes for radiation fields. The other classes are non-propagating tomographies, like MRI is an example, and it's a good example, all kinds of compressive nice things done there. There's some talks on it here. I don't happen to be interested in it. Other examples are tomographies of multi-dimensions, like hyperspectral imaging and video are examples of multi-dimensional tomographies. And then a final example might be diffusion tomography, which is another example of a field propagation. Of the 3 radiation propagating fields, we've done nice demonstrations of the value of compressive measurement, and these are, and also in the one of multidimensional tomography. These 2 here are demonstrations of diffraction tomography. This is some work we did with compressive photography, where we showed that we could measure a single snapshot Gabor hologram, very similar to the kinds of holograms that Professor Oskan just showed, and showed we could take a single 2-dimensional measurement and reconstruct true 3-dimensional tomographic data by applying constraints on the back propagation into the full image volume. We've repeated that work here with, that was at visible wavelengths. These are different planes in Z. This is kind of what the hologram looked like, but the non-propagating part of the hologram gets confined to the Z equals 0 plane, and then these were some dandelion seeds that we reconstructed at different Z planes independently. We repeated that at millimeter wave frequencies here with some different plastic objects at different ranges. This is an example of some work for coded aperture spectral imaging. We repeated this work for hyperspectral images, showing that we could reconstruct a 3-dimensional hyperspectral image from a single 2-dimensional measurement plane. This one is most related to what we're doing with X-rays. All of these are related in some sense, in the sense that when we do the tomography is slice selection. When we make a 2-dimensional measurement of a 3-dimensional object, we've kind of mixed all the slices together. To back them back out from compressive measurement, what we want is all the planes, all the different planes to be on an independent code. I'm not going to explain how we do that with diffraction tomography, although that would actually be the most interesting thing for the ultrasound community, because ultrasound is an example of diffraction tomography. But for the hyperspectral imaging, basically we're able to use coded apertures to modulate each of the spectral planes with an independent code that we can then analyze and find each of the spectral planes independently and reconstruct them back out. Okay, so that's some background on compressive tomography. When we think about how to move forward with these systems, basically to do compressive tomography, you need 2 things. You need the physical system that encodes the measurements and collects them in some intelligent way. You need to choose your measurements in a nice way. And then you need an inversion algorithm that will not asimilar to the kinds of algorithms that Adrian just talked about, that inverts and gives you a best estimate of your scene. I don't really work that much on the inversion algorithms because I have lots of friends that do a good job with that. Most of what I think about is the physical system. How do we implement codes that will contain resolution and features that I'm most interested in these systems? And so what my lab mostly does is we look at a system and say, here's the features that we're kind of interested in. Here's the kinds of measurements we could make. How do we jumble those together so that we can show that we have sensitivity in the principal components of our measurement system that are most related to the features that we're interested in? And when we do that, we're constrained by physics. We have to say, well, what are the things we can change? Usually we can change the illumination. We can play with the spectrum. We can modulate the visibility with optical elements. We can change the pixel size on the detectors. If we want to do digital super resolution, we can change the detector spectral response. But we go in and make a list of this and then just go try to change all of them to get the kind of sensitivity we want. The thing that we've been focused on in the last couple years is really applying this to radiance imaging, which is X-rays. So these are all models of measuring the same thing, the electromagnetic field, but just based on the frequency and resolution that you're interested in, you choose a different model for the field. With X-rays, we choose to work in terms of the radiance, which is the intensity of the field at a point in space, and the momentum of the field propagating in space. So on a surface, the radiance is going to be a four-dimensional function. All X-ray systems, mostly, at least reasonable CT systems, basically are radiance sensors. You can think of the general problem that you have in designing X-ray systems is that you don't have radiance cameras. What you measure is the intensity at a point. You can't measure the direction of propagation of the X-rays. So you choose a clever way to figure out how to constrain that so that you can get the radiance in some simple way in designing a tomographic system. This, of course, is very similar to the hyperspectral imaging problem. That in the hyperspectral imaging problem, we work with detectors that are insensitive to color, but we can code the color planes independently so we can make a color-insensitive detector sensitive to a wide range of colors. In fact, the problems are actually kind of identical, which is what led us here. As we went to Department of Homeland Security and said we make these visible hyperspectral imagers. They're the same as X-ray hyperspectral cameras, but in the case of X-rays, what you're interested in is the radiance and not really the color. In conventional CT systems, this problem, how do you get the radiance, is controlled by either controlling the illumination. For example, if you have a point target illuminating the object, then there is only one possible ray to each detector element, and so you only have to measure the intensity because you've constrained the radiance not to fully sample the range of radiance. But what you have to do then is move that detector as a function of time, and so you get a sequence of slices that allow you to reconstruct the full radiance function over a function of time. Alternatively, people have used coded apertures previously in X-ray systems under an assumption that all points in the object radiate in all directions, and that's conventional coded aperture imaging, where in this case, effectively what you're saying is at the plane of the coded aperture, you don't care what the intensity is at local points, you only care about the direction of propagation of the rays. And what the coded aperture does by allowing, you can imagine the coded aperture in the simplest case being a pinhole. By putting a pinhole and then looking at the rays that go through the pinhole, you've captured the direction of propagation, but not the radiance over the two-dimensional plane. Putting a coded aperture in allows you to collect the rays over a two-dimensional plane, but works essentially the same as a pinhole. So in each case, you've taken the four-dimensional radiance function and constrained it to be effectively a two-dimensional radiance function. Before we started doing experiments back in 2009, Krukl Choi and I published a paper in SPIE that talked about the similarity between what we were doing with coded aperture spectral imaging and coded aperture X-ray tomography. And the basic idea at that time was that if we put if you had a source array simultaneously illuminating the object, we could put a coded aperture between the sources and the object, and then each source would be propagating in a different direction. There would be some dispersion. Effectively, we'd have a different code on each source that we could then back out. So rather than doing tomography by illuminating by some sequence of sources, we could simultaneously illuminate with all the sources and separate them back out mathematically and do decompressive tomography. And in fact, we are working on versions of this even as we speak, but I'm going to talk about a simpler version of compressive X-ray imaging today. I want to back up just a minute and talk about, again, what I think about when we design these systems is how do we compare the different physical choices? We have infinitely different choices we could make in making a measurement. How do we say which one is better than the other, and how do we do design? And so what we're trying to do in these systems is basically to maximize the number of singular vectors, maximize the conditioning of the forward model, and maximize the overlap of the modes that we measure, the singular vectors, with features of the object. And I want to give you just a simple example of how we do that for a radiance camera. Our choices are controlling the source that's illuminating the object, putting optical elements between the source and the object, and optical elements after the source and before the detector array. A particular simple example would be just confine ourselves to the plane and say that the radiance consists of intensity along a line and then rays propagating at some angle theta relative to that line. And I could measure, I can measure intensity on some detector a distance away from the line, which is going to integrate over the rays direction of propagation of the radiance and just give me an intensity. And I can move that detector as a function of z, which is basically is a version of phase diversity imaging. If I move it as a function of z, I could get the full radiance function. I'm getting a radon transform in that case. If I move as a function of z, I'm making a three-dimensional transformation. I'm getting a radon transform of the radiance function. If I put a coded aperture in, and instead of moving as a function of z, I could choose to move the coded aperture laterally, I'm getting a different kind of transform. And one of the things that we've discovered, this is kind of interesting, is that actually using coded apertures, we can localize the kernel in space in a way that gives us better conditioning in actual radiance function or radon transforms imaging. So one of the compelling reasons ultimately that we get excited about coded aperture X-ray imaging is actually, it turns out to be better conditioned for tomography than radon transform imaging. And a simple example of that is shown here. If I do this radon approach to measuring the radiance here, as I move in Z, I'm measuring a function of projections through this two-dimensional radiance space that rotate. So it's giving me the conventional radon transforms. On the other hand, if I have the coded aperture, I'm taking each one of those ray projections through the radiance space and modulating them by the coded aperture. And then what happens if I move the coded aperture, each one of these rays is still measured, weighted by the coded aperture. The kernel is local, that I only measure along that ray. So I'm no longer integrating over the full volume, and that's going to give me, basically, in both cases, the singular value decomposition is going to go 1 over the square root of the number of points I'm imaging in any part of the kernel. But because one has a local kernel, it's going to be orders of magnitude better condition than something that has a kernel over the full space. And so that's the kinds of things we think about. And then the next step for us then is, so what, we're interested in specific features. For example, what if I told you that the object is going to emit its sharp angles over some, maybe it'll be kind of smooth in space and sharp in angle. If I code in the radon case, I get kind of a smooth, featureless features, where if I code in the coded aperture space, I could get some high frequency modulation, and that's then what's going to be a guiding principle for us in putting the system together. One may be better for one situation or another based on what I think my priors are for the structure of the object. So all of that is to say that this is kind of a toy problem that gives you an idea of how you think about the coding. The actual problems that we're spending a lot of time working on these days is improving X-ray systems, and ultimately, we have demonstrated now, I think, some major improvements to X-ray systems in the sense that Idrigan's talking about cell phone-based diagnostic instruments. We believe that we can make X-ray instruments that will be low exposure clinical instruments that rather than doing CT with large rotating gantries, you can have an arm CT that you would just hold your arm up to, and in a single snapshot it'll capture full CT data across local points. And I think that is important and cool, but the thing that really motivated us to get into this is we wanted to make X-rays something that is not just a structural imaging system, but something that's a molecular imaging system. And it turns out that there are molecular signatures in X-ray scatter that we can use to identify specific materials. This one is the one that the Department of Homeland Security is interested in. This is the molecular scatter spectrum for TNT. This is based on coherent scatter. It's basically nanocrystalline effects, nanocrystalline coherence in the material. If you have this kind of nanocrystalline structure. You're going to see coherent interference on the nanometer scale and scattering from the object that gives you coherent scatter structure in either the spectrum or the momentum transfer as X-rays scatter. Now, this is not going to work as well for liquids. You need materials that have oxide structure or other kinds of interesting structure, but it turns out to be true for lots of classes of interesting materials that we can see these kind of coherent scatter structure. And then there's also, of course, X-ray fluorescence and other molecular specific signatures that we can look for as we try to do molecular X-ray imaging. So to image this coherent scatter, basically what we're trying to do is the same thing as what you would do with X-ray diffractometry. But with X-ray diffractometry, conventionally you have a small sample, you put it in X-rays, and you look at the scatter spectrum. We're doing X-ray diffractometry tomographic imaging. So we're trying to get the molecular scatter signal at every point in a volume. And it turned out that we were able to show that we could do this in a well-conditioned way in a single snapshot with a pencil beam if we put a coated aperture between the pencil beam and the detector. Now, this turns out to be different from conventional coated aperture imaging because what happens is you get a scatter spectrum from each point in the volume, and each point along this volume emits some cone of rays, and the difference between different range points is that they'll see different magnification on the detector. If I scatter some fixed angle from this volume, it scatters out to some large ring. If I scatter at the same angle here, it scatters out to a smaller ring. So the difference in different range points is differences in magnification. So we had to come up with a new kind of way of thinking about coated apertures. Traditionally, coated apertures are used in two situations primarily. One is what I showed you before, where you're placing a pinhole with a coated aperture. What you want is a coated aperture that is orthogonal on translation, so you can tell if the image has been shifted. And so people use these Golay codes that are orthogonal on translation. The alternative is coated apertures have been used a lot in spectroscopy, which is not a spatially ordered imaging system, and there you want coated apertures that are well conditioned for inversion but are not really spatially related. Here we want a coated aperture that's orthogonal on magnification instead of orthogonal on translation. And it turns out functions that are orthogonal on magnification are sines and cosines. Harmonic functions are orthogonal on magnification, so we chose to use a harmonic coated aperture here. I won't get into the details, but basically we do maximum likelihood estimators to take our measured coded data and reconstruct the full tomographic image along a pencil beam. This is what an experiment looks like. We have an X-ray source back here. Here's the collimator. Here's the object's going to go along the path of the pencil beam, and here's what our coded aperture looks like. In this case, X-rays. Despite you're working at very small wavelengths, typically you're interested in resolutions that are on the millimeter or centimeter scale, and so our coded apertures are actually just milled out of lead in this case. We've lately been making smaller coded apertures where we use 3D printers and fill them up with tungsten powder to create coded apertures. But this is what a single snapshot reconstruction looks like for paths along a pencil beam. So this is pencil beam is a function of Z in centimeters. We put aluminum at one range and salt at another range. And so you're seeing the density integrated for the full spectrum of the aluminum and the salt. And then at each one of the, if you reach in here and click on this, we can reconstruct the full scatter spectrum of the salt at one range and the aluminum at another range. And so you can identify that they are what they are. And then these are results from this paper in Optics Express earlier this year on pencil beam coated aperture systems. More recently, we've been spending a lot of time working on compressive versions of this and going up to, this system, you're getting a full reconstruction along the pencil beam, but then you'd have to raster scan the pencil beam to do a full three-dimensional reconstruction. We've more recently been focusing a lot on fan beam systems where we illuminate with a fan beam system, measure the scatter out of the plane, and reconstruct the fan beam, which then becomes two-dimensional measurements to reconstruct a three-dimensional space and spectral volume. So that's a decompressive reconstruction system. That one, then becomes both of these are interesting in the sense that, in contrast with conventional X-ray tomography, where you have to make a bunch of measurements and then process them to reconstruct the volume, these measurements reconstruct the volume that you illuminated in a single snapshot. So that the part that you illuminated, you're done as soon, and you never illuminate it again. And that's obviously going to be very important to the way you think about how X-rays should be applied, and allows you to create X-rays without rotating anything and without illuminating with high intensity over a number of exposures. So in the case of the fan beam, we're going to have a two-dimensional object in X and Y, and then third dimension is the scatter angle, and that translates into this four-dimensional radiance function coming out, and we're trying to use the coded aperture to estimate that radiance. The results I'm going to show here are simulations. We'll have a paper coming out on actual experimental data from the fan beam probably in a month or so, but actually Department of Homeland Security is sensitive about us telling you too much too fast, so I'm going to show you some simulations right now. So in this case, we used a pseudo-random code rather than because we're interested in not just scale reproduction. We have to now get cross range in the fan beam as well. These are an example of where we have objects at two different positions in transverse position, and then different points in range. And then this is what the measured data would look like in this case with not the pseudo-random code, but with the periodic code. But these are what reconstructions then look like. Again, you reconstruct the spectrum independently for the two objects and reconstruct their spatial position independently as well. These are for two pieces of aluminum. This is two pieces of graphite. The difference being that you have this different spectrum. The nice thing that you see here is these coherent scatter spectra tend to be sparse. They tend to be spiky, which allows us to do this decompressive inference. And of course, our objects are kind of pretty sparse and smooth here as well. Here's reconstructions of a variety of different objects in the same scene with salt and aluminum at different points in space, and then in the spectrum again independently reconstructed. What I hope I've shown you is that this idea of compressive tomography applies basically to any kind of tomography. Once you decide what kind of codes you want to implement, you can basically, the world is your oyster. There's no measurement system you can't go and improve. We're very excited about applications of this to X-rays, and I think as we've dug deeper into this, of course, you start off thinking, I don't know anything about X-rays. How are we going to do anything about this? And then, of course, this term, I know everything about X-rays because I'm teaching a class in X-rays, so I have to act like I know what we're talking about. But as we've dug deeper in it, it's just gotten richer and richer. We're working here with a kind of simple detector model for the X-rays, and then using, we've been using mostly radiographic photodiode arrays from medical CT systems. We're increasingly interested in doing digital pixel super resolution. There are nice X-ray spectral detectors so that we can combine energy resolving detectors in the case of X-rays with the radiance resolving detectors, and that will allow us to continue to improve our sensor efficiency. We're looking at combining this with the stuff I talked about earlier, where we would do coded multi-source illumination with X-rays. I think the current main frontier in compressive tomography focuses on adaptive measurement, where you illuminate, make some measurements, and then update your illumination strategy based on your current estimate of the object, and that yields much, much higher compression ratios than what we get with this kind of static or fixed coding. And so it's an area that just has room for a lot of research, I think, for years to come. So thanks very much.
Thanks. Questions and discussion? Come on, man. I will start with a question. So since this is different groups thinking about different technologies overlapping, I'm going to ask two questions, both ignorant, well, showing my ignorance, but I'm trying to make a connection. One, when you're early experiments where you're testing some of these ideas, it seems to me you're dealing with these sparsely filled space, the aluminum, etc. Ultimately, one will deal with larger objects in which there's structure internally. And then you're going to have X-ray absorption and emission scattering, let's say, as a function of a macroscopic object with structure inside, and coming from along the line, as you said, and then detection. In some sense, my optics way of thinking it is that wherever the scattering is occurring, it then has to pass through the medium, and there's some sort of apodization, essentially, through that medium, and then a series of, as you move along Z. Is there any way to think of that there's information there, essentially, or is that trivial and it's redundant with what you're doing? If you see what I mean.
Yeah, so let me answer that, and then I can go to your second question. That's a common problem with X-rays in any kind of volume imaging system, is that you have to deal with the modulation of the beam by the object. First order, of course, you just ignore it and say, I'm going to assume a Born approximation, everything just scatters once and it's done. Then the second order thing to do would be some kind of recursive fitting to the object and estimating the scatter. Certainly, for scatter imaging, we start with the assumption that stuff only gets scattered once, and if it gets scattered twice, that's causes artifacts for us. It's an interesting, and I think a long-term problem, that if you're doing kind of a global system, and like we're doing the fan beam, and we're only illuminating the fan, and the scattering happening outside of the fan, that's hard for us to account for. But if we scan the fan so that we build an image of the object, then we could build a recursive algorithm that would start to model the scattering and try to get information out of it, or at least try to remove the artifacts that it causes.
Right, and especially if you go in with some information about the approximate internal constituents, let's say it's a body or something that you know something about approximately going in, that might start, you could have a...
I think this is where adaptation is really going to come into play too, because then the other thing you can do is once you get an estimate of the object, you can say, well, what illumination could I give that would minimize those kind of artifacts?
Right.
And you'd go back and re-illuminate to try to get rid of them.
Right. Now my second question had to do with correspondence or lack thereof, especially in your classification system of these different types of tomographies between X-rays, which you're studying now, and ultrasound, which we heard about this morning.
So ultrasound is generally it's a coherent way. So it's an example of diffraction tomography. So it's equivalent basically to our work in holography and work with millimeter waves and radar. I think that whole class of systems, there's just a lot of people doing interesting work on that. And the main issue with that type of tomography, by the way, is that what's cool is each one of these, it's all starting with propagating waves, but you end up with what are the main challenges. And in diffraction tomography, in one sense, it's beautiful because you naturally tend to measure in Fourier space, which is a global sample of your object and is kind of well conditioned for compressive measurement. But the killer of all coherent tomography or coherent tomographies or diffraction tomography is that objects aren't really sparse because they tend to have speckle, and that the speckle field is not sparse. So our solution to that has been to build a model that does incoherent imaging with coherent fields. So that so we have a couple of papers on this idea of what we call a diffuse holography, where we build a forward model that tries to estimate the underlying scattering intensity from coherent measurements. And actually, we have a paper that's just about finished on that. One of the ways to think about that is compressive measurement on what nominally is non-compressive data, because essentially the way people tend to deal with speckle is to try to average it out, take some block and average. Another way to think about it is that if you measure an image that has speckle in it, it's not as many measurements as you think it is. And that's what averaging is doing, but you shouldn't average based on kind of just a local average. You should average on some kind of compressive kernels. And that gives us some very nice results, actually, for
smarter averaging.
For despeckling, basically, of data. But an equivalent way to think about it would be build a model that is aware that you're trying to estimate statistics of the object, and that the image is not the raw image that you measured. But the take-home message for that is that there's huge opportunities in diffraction tomography, but the main issue is speckle, not these other things.
Thank you. More? Yes. Speak up so we can hear you.
Yeah, what's the optimal biomedical application that this technique could be used in to image a volume or characterize tissue, to detect an object, and what's the distribution of this modality?
Well, first of all, I should say this is very new work, so we're not, and I'm not paid to think about biomedical applications. We are working with we work with Martin Tournai, who's in radiology at Duke, and he's interested in breast tissue scanning. So I mean, certainly I think that that will be, but basically I think that this work is going to impact all X-ray tomography. It's a generalization of X-ray tomography that, at the very least, you can augment conventional photoelectric tomography with these new methods. Near-term applications, I think, are going to be smaller scale, lower cost tomographic systems. Although, you know, in the very near term, this is more likely to impact biomedical research than diagnostics, because I think that this reference structure approach is also a very nice way for us to do X-ray microscopes, where we'll be able to, rather than using a synchrotron to study crystal structure of proteins, I think we can make microscopes that can study them on very low-cost lab instruments. The answer is sort of everything, and I don't really know.
More questions?
So a lot of what you seem to talk about, like it applied very well to situations where you're looking at the scattered data. Is there any sense in which these coded apertures could be useful in a purely transmissive mode?
Yeah. In fact, that was the original approach I was talking about, where we're coding the sources. That rather than illuminate sequentially, so basically any measurement system where you're measuring sequential pixels, or where you're controlling anything that happens in sort of a spatially sequential local way, has got to be a mistake. Because, you know, like if you're measuring an image and you measure this pixel and then you measure the pixel next to it, that's the most correlated data. That's not as efficient as you could be information theoretically. You need to measure here, and then what would be the next most uncorrelated measurement to go to? That would be the way to maximize your information transfer. And so you know that tomographic systems can't be right, because if you're scanning kind of sequentially, you're not collecting data efficiently. Now, it's not easy with a rotating gantry to sort of, you know, look from here and then look from over here, but people are now making all kinds of source arrays where you could turn on a source over here and then a source over here. So what we're working on, for example, is adaptive control of source arrays in a way that would maximize the efficiency. And so, yeah, one of the applications of this will be to drastically lower the exposure and improve the efficiency of conventional projection tomography.
Okay. Any more questions? If not, let's thank